Hundreds of thousands of Americans served in Iraq over the past 9 years in a conflict that will have a lasting impact. As the war is declared over, we talk about their experiences and the lessons learned. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Brutality. 2011 will go down in history as the year that America's second longest war officially came to an end. President Obama said US troops can leave Iraq with, quote, their heads held high. But for some, that is not so easy. Now that they are home, Inside Story Americas examines their experiences and the lessons and legacy of the Iraq War. Josh Stieber served in the US Army in Iraq during the so-called surge in 2006. But he felt he could not be a soldier while holding on to his sense of morality. He became a conscientious objector and subsequently an advocate for the peaceful resolution of conflict. Here's his story in his own words.
I'm Josh Stieber. I live in Washington, D.C. I was in the military for almost 3 years, and we got deployed as part of the surge in 2007. So we got sent to the poor industrial part of town a few miles south of Sadr City. The locals held a massive peaceful protest, told us they didn't want us in their neighborhood. And so that was one of the first real clashes for me. Was here is this rhetoric that I have and that, you know, it was kind of used to justify the war, that we're giving a voice to an oppressed people and letting them determine their own fate. And here are the people gathering, telling us that they don't want us in their neighborhoods. There would be, you know, sniper shots fired at us from the general area, and then we would go on regular patrols and search through people's houses. I thought that, you know, violence could be used as a force for good, but I was seeing that having this negative effect and, again, turning people against us, and it was hard to find people to talk about or to really get answers to the stuff I was asking about. I started turning to books, and so I read some books by Leo Tolstoy, who kind of got to a position of pacifism. Men will commit the most atrocious acts without seeing their responsibility for them. In ancient times, tyrants got credit for the crimes they committed, but in our day, the most atrocious infamies, inconceivable under the Neros, are perpetrated, and no one gets blamed for them. At first, I didn't even know what conscientious objection was, and I just knew that I wasn't going to keep contributing to the things that were going on. So I got out in April, and then a few weeks later in May, started walking and then bicycling across the United States to share my experiences. I kind of wanted to dedicate myself to not making excuses, to carry out things for people that I really couldn't sympathize with when I was sympathizing so much with the families who were being affected by our presence in Iraq.
So, what lessons did US troops learn in Iraq, and have they returned home to a country receptive to their experiences? To discuss this, I'm joined by US Marine Ross Caputi. He recently wrote an article for the Guardian newspaper entitled, "I'm sorry for the role I played in Fallujah." We're also joined from New York City by war correspondent Chris Hedges. He's the co-author of the book Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. And also here in the studio, we have Manal Omar, who worked as an aid worker in Iraq during the war. She's the director of the Iraq and Iran program at the US Institute of Peace. Ross Caputi, first of all then, why are you sorry for the role you played in Fallujah?
Well, what we did to Fallujah, I don't think anyone in my unit ever would have condoned doing to their own family. It was completely brutal. We forced about 200,000 people out of their homes, and they had to make do. They either had to go live in the desert or find some neighboring village that would shelter them and just make do in any way that they can. We completely dehumanized the population of Fallujah. The corporate media claimed that it had been taken over by terrorists and dead-enders and anti-Americans, and that they were the backbone of the insurgency, and that we were going to come in, sweep through, and so-called liberate the city of Fallujah. In doing so, we destroyed a major portion of the city, turned it into complete rubble. We killed thousands of civilians, and it's very possible that the weapons we used caused a really serious health crisis that the people of Fallujah are suffering from today. There are huge rates of birth defects and cancers in the city right now.
But how was that justified at the time? What were you told you were fighting for? Was there a coherent argument other than simply this is just for the general battle?
I think it was coherent, but it was a lie. It said what my command told us is that terrorists had taken over the city of Fallujah, and they had some sort of irrational hatred for America. It had nothing to do with our foreign policy. It had nothing to do with the fact that we illegally invaded Iraq and were occupying it against the wishes of the Iraqi population.
But why did you sign up in the first place?
I have to admit, I signed up for very selfish reasons. I signed up because I was 18 years old and I was graduating from high school, and I was looking for some sort of adventure. I was looking for a way to pay for college. I wanted people in my hometown to like me and respect me. I wanted girls to sleep with me. For all these reasons, joining the Marine Corps seemed like a pretty good deal. It had more to do with that and less to do with defending freedom and democracy and abstract philosophical concepts like that.
But the Marine training is pretty tough. I mean, are you actually asked, presumably you're not told to actually question why you're fighting, you're told to fight, surely, and obey orders.
Yeah, that's true, but I think that's a cop-out. As a human being, we have a moral obligation to not harm other human beings, and that's exactly what we were doing in Fallujah. It was perfectly obvious. I mean, when we were being trucked out to the city of Fallujah, I saw women and children walking around in the desert, and I understood that these were the people that we were supposedly liberating. And when we were going house to house in the city of Fallujah, I saw the family photos up on the wall. I saw the bullet holes in the wall and the blast marks and the walls that have been battered down and houses that have been totally turned into rubble. And I understood that families used to live here. We destroyed their houses. We destroyed their lives. I saw dead bodies of resistance fighters on the ground. And for a brief moment, I asked myself, what would I have done if I were in their shoes? And I understood. But again, selfish motivations kept me from doing the right thing. I wasn't willing to stick my neck out and say that I thought that this was wrong.
Chris Hedges, though, I mean, there are some who would listen to that testimony and say, but this is war. Horrible things happen in war. It's the nature of war. But in the end, this was for at least at the time, what some giving these orders thought was for the greater good. This is just how it is. What would your response be?
I'd say that there are different types of war, all of which I've covered. The Central American insurgencies are essentially civil wars. The first Gulf War, where I went into Kuwait with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, which was essentially, if one discounts the saturation bombing of southern Iraq, a clash between large mechanized units, and then occupation, wars of occupation like Israel's occupation of Gaza or our occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. And wars where you have foreign invaders coming in who are culturally, linguistically, and historically illiterate, i.e. they are unable to speak the language. They are unable to communicate with those they are occupying other than through the language of force, are always the dirtiest types of wars. You're fighting an elusive enemy who you can rarely see. This creates, in the words of the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, atrocity-producing situations where you take casualties either from an IED or from a lightning ambush. You can't actually strike back against the perpetrators, and so you begin to lash out at the civilian population around you. And of course, as you just heard, this is precisely what happened in Fallujah, but also in many other parts of Iraq. And these wars become one huge atrocity. Wars always involve murder, and by that I mean the taking of a life of somebody who does not have the capacity to harm you as opposed to killing. But in wars of occupation like these, it's primarily about murder. There's actually very little killing.
Manal, I mean, it's striking, though, that there has been very little discussion about what actually happened in Iraq. When there is valuable discussion, it's usually in terms of the number of people killed and so forth. Actually, we have some of the figures that are often discussed. Even those, though, you know, we don't have definitive numbers, but estimates range from over 1 million dead Iraqis, according to a 2008 study by the London-based polling agency Opinion Research Business, down to 150,000. It's thought that even more Iraqis were injured. According to the UN, some 5 million Iraqis left their homes because of the violence because either being internally displaced or who are now living as internal refugees or refugees in other nations. Those are the sort of numbers we hear. But is there any reckoning, as far as you can tell, any real discussion of what those numbers mean and what has been left behind?
I think it's a difficult question to answer because different people use different points of entry, and I think it's a little bit of a trick that we've been using, particularly in the U.S. When you look at Iraq, 2003 was a very different situation than it was 2005, 2006, than it was in 2008, and then it is today. So, for example, most of the time today in the discussions, you'll hear about how Iraq has improved. In fact, Iraq has improved if you look at 2006 figures, which Iraqis call the Dark Ages. It was one of the worst times possible for Iraq. You were literally walking over dead bodies constantly, no matter where you turned. But if you compare the situation to 2003, the situation has gotten worse. And the situation, basic indicators, access to health, access to education, water, till today, electricity, all have not improved if the comparison is to 2003. So again, the numbers are a little bit tricky because people will compare to different ages. Before the surge and after the surge, you see improvement. The biggest question we've had with the surge is how sustainable is any of the improvement, because you've basically put up walls and divided out the neighborhoods and divided out the cities. And as we're seeing today, those walls are coming down and the violence is escalating.
Ross Caputi, though, I mean, specifically about the sort of military action taken, you were talking about the birth defects now in Fallujah, for example, and certainly we at Al Jazeera have done reports on that. Do you find much interest in that sort of the military legacy of the conflict in the U.S.?
I'm not sure what you mean by interest. I feel incredibly guilty about it, and I personally feel like I have a moral obligation to do something about it, to raise awareness that this happened, to do something to help the people of Fallujah. While I was there, I carried a radio on my back. My radio may have called in airstrikes that did this to those poor people. And I run an organization called the Justice for Fallujah Project, and the whole point of this is to raise awareness about that. And the scientific research that has been done about this health crisis so far points to weapons that we used during the first and second siege as the most likely cause of this health crisis. So I feel directly responsible.
And as far as the rules of engagement are concerned, did you recognize in what Chris Hedges was saying there some of the sort of the MO of action? I mean, how do you delineate between combatants and civilians and so forth in a situation like this?
Well, in the case of the second siege of Fallujah, my command actually lied to us. They knew perfectly well that there were still civilians in the city. That was a lie. There were thousands of civilians in the city at the time. And they told us to basically use any force that was necessary. So we were using completely indiscriminate tactics like reconnaissance by fire, which is when, if you don't know there's something in a building, you fire into it. If you hear wailing and screaming after, that means there are people in the building, and then you act accordingly. We were doing things like bulldozing entire neighborhoods. Tactics like this that were completely indiscriminate and I'm sure killed plenty of innocent civilians. So it's not really applicable to the situation of the second siege of Fallujah.
But when you say, though, that you can therefore understand and mourn not just your comrades who died as Marines in Fallujah, but also those who fought against the Marines, what sort of reaction do you get?
The people who were in my unit, they've called me everything from a traitor to a terrorist to to this to that to anti-American. And I just think if they sat down and really considered the question honestly, that they would acknowledge that if they were in their shoes, they would do the exact same thing.
It's interesting, in the context of the Republican presidential campaign, Ron Paul, who does take an isolationist foreign policy stance, has actually got one advert running, which we'd like to play a portion of. His campaign recently released an advert asking Americans to imagine life under occupation if Chinese troops invaded Texas. Here's a portion of that advert.
Imagine that thousands of armed foreign troops were constantly patrolling American streets in military vehicles. Imagine they were here under the auspices of keeping us safe, or promoting democracy, or protecting their strategic interests. Imagine that they operated outside of U.S. law and that the Constitution did not apply to them. Imagine that every now and then they made mistakes or acted on bad information and accidentally killed or terrorized innocent Americans, including women and children, most of the time with little or no repercussions or consequences.
Chris Hedges, how can a government allow that sort of analysis of occupation to be widely discussed if they want to keep, quote, all options on the table at all times. Should it be much of a surprise that this isn't being analyzed in any sort of real, meaningful way?
Well, certainly the Democratic and Republican parties have a vested interest in perpetuating the American imperium and the contractors and corporations for whom these wars are particularly good business. And that's why Ron Paul has been pushed to the margins of the political establishment. And I would add figures like Dennis Kucinich and Ralph Nader also, because that's a narrative that the mainstream has pretty ruthlessly shut out. And I would add that a corporate-controlled media has not allowed to be raised for general discussion, although, of course, I think it makes a very valid point.
And nonetheless, the evidence is leaking out, notably, of course, recently, the WikiLeaks collateral damage video, which I think really allowed people to see the sort of action that was being taken. And also recently, information about the massacre in Haditha in Iraq. A New York Times journalist just stumbling on 400 pages of secret interviews in a junkyard in Iraq. And it's interesting because clearly there was some sort of internal inquiry in the military. And we have a few quotes that were found amongst the documentation talking about the deaths of 20 civilians. One Marine testified that, quote, "it wasn't remarkable." Major General Steve Johnson, the commander of American forces in Anbar, said he did not feel compelled to go back and examine the events because, quote, "it happened all the time." And he called the killing of civilians, quote, "a cost of doing business." Again, Chris Hedges, this is just war there. I mean, I guess this is what they're going to say, that this is just how war is and conflict is, and sometimes you have to do bad things to keep, quote, freedom alive or something, I suppose.
You know, every time an incident like this, including Abu Ghraib, comes up, what they try and do is disconnect it from the pattern. And that is what Leila El-Anari and I did when we interviewed these 50 combat vets who had returned from Iraq in collateral damage, to talk about the pattern of atrocities, that at checkpoints, at raids, detentions, every time they laid down suppressing fire when an IED went off, you had tremendous civilian casualties, and nobody ever went back and counted, and nobody went back and looked. And so what they'll try and do is isolate the event. And I think Americans have effectively been kept, certainly the broader public, from seeing that Iraq, like the war in Vietnam, has just been one long atrocity.
Manal Omar, though, and what's interesting about those quotes from Haditha, though, is that it's clear then that the routine nature of killing civilians has been documented. But it's also clear that there is an awareness of that routine killing of civilians amongst military as part of any military operation. Do you find in your work then that there is much comprehension of this when we refer back to the war in Iraq, when we refer back to troops coming home with their heads held high and so forth?
I mean, I think that there's definitely an awareness, as you've already pointed out. People feel that it's the cost of war. People talk about casualties of war. I think what's important is to recognize that, you know, again, there are different points in Iraq. And in 2003, there were Iraqis who were excited about the presence of the U.S. And I think what Fallujah and Haditha did is really represent a shift in general, and not only in terms of how U.S. was performing, but how U.S. was perceived by Iraqis themselves. And I think that that's the particular trigger where it turned from a potential, the rhetoric of a war of liberation to a very clear, in the Iraqi mindset, a war of occupation. And I think Fallujah and Haditha really hit that point. That's when Iraqis took a step back and said, no matter what potential good may come out, there was a question of the cost, and it was clear that they would be paying the cost.
And that's interesting because even now, though, in the discussion in the mainstream, certainly, about Iraq and the situation it's in right now, when there is discussion about, well, what if the sectarian tensions flare up again? What if there is more conflict? The argument is framed as, does that mean we should send our troops back in? The U.S. forces are still seen, therefore, as a force for stability if Iraq does fracture even further. But of course, I mean, do you think that's how they would be seen, given the experience?
It depends. I mean, I think that, in 2004, very early on, Iraqis were saying, thank you, U.S., but you need to leave now. So that was, almost instantly. After 6 months, that was a constant call. But again, gratitude. Whereas I think the gratitude sense has really weakened over the years. I think that what has happened, and what particularly ironically the parties who were calling the entry occupation are saying, if you've weakened the dynamics so much that you've now left us vulnerable, vulnerable not only to internal issues but vulnerable to neighboring countries, and you have a responsibility to ensure that doesn't happen.
But surely not by the redeployment of troops.
I don't think by the redeployment of troops. I think that the biggest question has been saying that the military relationship has ended. Now you're going to have a civilian and diplomatic relationship. People from all the way from Maliki to the Speaker of the House, Osama Najafi, are welcoming the civilian and diplomatic, but the biggest question is, what will that look like, and how will the Iraqis be involved from the beginning? So it's not intervention that's being imposed, but it's done collaboration with Iraqis' needs at the forefront.
Ross Caputi, when the post-traumatic stress disorder comes up though in discussion in the media, and that does come up from time to time in a very sympathetic manner, various figures are produced. Actually, we have some of them that do get quoted quite a lot. There are no definitive numbers necessarily, but 1/3 of combat veterans who served in Iraq, we understand, experienced depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, according to a study done last year by the US Army. A leading cause of PTSD is guilt that troops experience due to moral dilemmas faced in combat, according to a new US military study of active duty Marines. And veterans who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan are more likely to take their own lives than those who served in other wars, according to a study by the University of Georgia. And there is quite a lot of sympathetic coverage about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But there isn't much analysis of the traumatic stress that led to the disorder, specifically what the TS means in the PTSD. Is that what you find then?
I think that speaks volumes about the nature of this war. As Mr. Hedges described, this is a war of atrocity. We're not building schools and hospitals like the corporate media would tell us sometimes. People do not go home and want to kill themselves because they've been helping the Iraqis. They go home and want to kill themselves because they've committed atrocities and they can't live with it.
And it's interesting, Chris Hedges, I mean, there is a discussion right now going on about the rather quiet ending to the Iraq war. But more in a discussion of whether there should be a ticker tape parade in New York City, both from the left to the right. Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, a noted progressive commentator, to Rick Perry in the Republican Trail, saying it's a scandal that there's been no formal recognition of the troops' service. But I mean, again, if that's the only discussion about the legacy of the war and how we analyze the war, I suppose that also speaks volumes.
Yeah, I mean, remember, it took a long time for America to come to terms with what happened in Vietnam. I think any real discussion of what took place was probably at least a decade after the war, and I think probably the same will be true here. Let's also be clear, the war in Iraq is not over. It is breaking down along sectarian lines, as was pointed out, as the walls come down, these blast walls that have divided neighborhoods, turned Baghdad into a kind of labyrinth of Shiite, Sunni, Kurd, are disintegrated. We are seeing, again, a rise. Iraq, I think, as a unified country, is over. I don't think it'll ever come back. The war is not over at all. And we've trashed the place. We've left, hundreds of thousands of dead and bitter antagonisms, especially Shiite versus Sunni. The Kurds, I think, are going to drift off into their own sphere. They essentially have a kind of de facto state in the north. So the war isn't over at all.
But as far as the discussion of actually what war means, beyond ticker tape parades and heads being held high, as we move further and further into covert warfare, Chris Hedges, though, it would seem that we are moving in an opposite direction to what you might like, I would imagine.
Right, it's essentially covert. I mean, remember, we have 16,000 mercenaries in there.
But not just in Iraq, but elsewhere. I mean, it would appear that the days of perhaps of invading armies on the borders and frontiers might be over, and now it's all more about special operations, drones, and so forth there.
Yeah, I mean, remember, we're still pretty deeply embroiled in Afghanistan, and we're losing in that war. We're losing pretty badly. But I think getting to the larger issue of how do they respond, I think we don't know how to respond, because this has not, in any sense of the word, been a victory. Peace and prosperity have not been visited, much less democracy, upon Iraq. These armed factions are still going at each other's throats. Disintegration, I think, is very likely. So it's a kind of messy withdrawal. We've walked away from a situation which finally, number one, where we weren't wanted. That's the only reason we left. And number two, we couldn't handle it financially or physically.
Chris Hedges, thank you very much. One last thought.
Saying that bad things happen in war. These sort of things just happen. Collateral damage is a fact of war. War is not a moral agent. It's not capable of maiming and killing human beings. Human beings kill other human beings. And that sort of language is a cop-out. Veterans like myself, we need to own what we've done, and we can't put it off on abstract concepts like war. And that's a first step to doing something sensible about these wars.
Ross Kabuti, Manal Omar, and Chris Hedges, thank you all very much. And that's all from the team in Washington for now. Do tell us what you want us to cover. Email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.